I'm going to kind of go over a lot of what Jim Mullins actually was talking about. In terms of the NSF data management requirements that have been released, as Jim indicated in May, NSF had made a formal announcement that all proposals, and originally it was October, now it's January, would be required to have a 2-page data management plan submitted as a supplemental document to all proposals. This has been kind of a long time coming. In some ways, as I was talking to a few others earlier today, NSF has been threatening this for quite some time, talking about, well, we need to have more public access to the data. We need to be able to sharing it. We're burying all this data, all this knowledge into institutions or even individual researchers' labs where, somebody retires and then the data just sits in a box, a computer, or, eventually it just gets destroyed. They have made a formal requirement. Any proposal submitted on or after January 18th of this upcoming year will be required to have this 2-page data management plan. And while 2 pages doesn't seem overwhelming, when you start reading all the subparts, you're like, okay, how am I going to address that? Probably one of the more interesting sites, if you do a Google search on NSF data management plan, there is a site that not only talks about the policy, but for each of the directorates, a number of them have given additional information or requirements about what they expect to see from proposals within that directorate or that division. So if you are working towards an NSF submission sometime on or after January 18th, I would definitely go to the website, see what that individual directorate or that division is requiring. Sometimes they give you more helpful advice in terms of what they're seeing and what they're expecting, and other times it's just a bunch more in terms of requirements. Jim went over this just briefly. So here are the components for the NSF data management plan, what they're expecting. Some information, background about what types of data are produced. And if you've been here throughout the day, we have everything from Robert Browning's video archive and all the data associated with that. And he's getting luckier because now there's more information coming available because he has all the transcripts based on, for the closed captioning. He's getting more information from the supplemental cameras. So he's getting more, but what do you do with video data versus data coming off of the genomic sequencers versus other types of data, whether it be public information like Soren Matei is doing with the Wikipedia or some other types. Real interesting challenge in terms of the standards that are going to be applied to the data. And as we were working through this committee this past fall, one of the challenges has been, some disciplines are very well structured. Some. I would argue that most disciplines are not that way. And so one of the challenges that many faculty will have is, okay, what kind of standards are they going to use for the metadata? And this is where the librarian faculty here on our campus are going to be absolutely essential in terms of offering advice and assistance in terms of what's even out there now and what could possibly be used. Ultimately, you have to have policies for access and sharing, policies for revision and reuse. So there's a question in the back about, okay, how do you start monitoring all the different derivations of the data? Jim mentioned about using different derivations of DOI. Ultimately, for particular disciplines, you have this whole issue of data provenance, and where you kind of show exactly who made what changes to what data when, and kind of keeping track of how it's evolved over time. And for some areas, that's going to be absolutely critical, and for other areas, it may not be. And finally, what's the long-term plans for archiving? And so how are you going to maintain this after the period of the grant? how you can maintain this for 7 or 10 years. One of the things that there aren't necessarily good answers is, at what point do you throw something out? And one of the speakers talked about that. Can you keep everything forever? And even in the biggest community that loves to keep things, whether it be the archivist or I would say your traditional librarians, they even go through their collections and purge things that need to be purged. And so we have a lot of work to do about how do we archive and what do we do. In terms of the current activities at Purdue, Jim mentioned some things. So there's the data curation profile toolkit that just got released today is going on. There's also some work going on with PIs that we know are submitting in January, trying to develop data management plans, which will then in turn be going back to the VPR office so that other faculty can use those data management plans as guides and then try to build a collection of these. The general belief is early on, these data management plans are going to be kind of a fairly low bar to get. Kind of like the education and outreach used to be. And then over time, that bar is going to be raised. And my personal belief, the bar is going to be raised much faster than the education and outreach bar has been raised. And so, right now, many institutions are trying to figure out how to make this work. I think I expect to see on review panels where the distribution, the answer is, well, we have a website, people can go here. And then over time, it's going to be, well, the institution gets these grants. What's the institutional commitment to archiving this data, allowing access to the data? And so that will happen. And then Jim mentioned the data hub. We're kind of talking about renaming to the research hub that will enable faculty to use. And the intent behind this hub is really not so much people like David Salt, who has made a career in terms of developing a huge hub dedicated to the proteomics community. It is what happens to the common grant that is $100,000, $200,000 that doesn't have the capital to turn around and invest in a whole infrastructure. So this is to provide faculty with an infrastructure that will allow them to build their data submission, keep some curation, be able to share it through the life of the grant, because the grant doesn't require you to post all the data immediately after it's collected. And so you'll be able to share and work through that. So where do you go for help? If you have a data management plan that you're working for here in January and February, I would like, please come up afterwards. Please come up during the reception. Either corner me, corner Jim Mullins that's here. Another good resource is Scott Brandt in the libraries. Come to us. Let us know that you're working on this, because I think early on, what we're going to have to do is go through an iterative process. There aren't good answers at this moment. There's some, better informed choices, but in the end, it's going to take an iterative process to refine and get this going. So that's kind of a little bit about the Purdue's response to what we're looking at in terms of the NSF requirement to the data management plan. And with that, I'd like to open it up to some questions, and I may pull Jim Mullins up here too. Any questions? Oh, that was... Okay. How about a drawing then? Someone want to pull a drawing?
John, if I could just say one.
Sure, come on up, Jim. We'll wait until the papers come so you can...
One of the reasons why in the libraries we're so concerned about data being made available publicly and easily accessible is that we see the potential for data to become a commodity. And the publishers right now, most of you know, require that data be submitted with articles, journals that you have to submit your data to a repository that the publisher either maintains or that they approve of, so that the article can be linked back to that data. We're very, very concerned that this data, once it's accumulated by the publishers, such as Elsevier, Wiley, Springer, becomes a large enough commodity that they can in turn sell it to the researchers. And so just as we gave up keeping the scholarship within academe, when we turned it over back to the commercial publishers, and that we're now confronted with 7 to 8% increases every year to purchase the same materials that we purchased the year before, the potential is there for the data to also become a commodity. So we want to make sure that it stays in the public realm and that data does not become something that we end up having to buy from a distributor. So that's one of the final reasons for why NSF and the others have said this is absolutely critical, that we've got to keep this data available, openly available for researchers in the US and worldwide.
All right. Oh, is there a question?
Yes, thanks. We've adopted an open access policy of some type or other that seems to run afoul of the publishing requirements, but we have this sort of out that involves having a sort of pre-publishing copy of the document that is in the open source repository. That's not exactly practical with data sets. I mean, a data set is a data set, and you can't really make a pre-published version of it. It's in all respects identical to the post-published one. So how are we going to deal with that issue with the publishers?
The difference between an article and a data set is that an article is copyrightable. You can have intellectual property in that article. Data cannot be copyrighted. Pure data cannot be copyrighted. And if it's numerical, I mean, if it's a video or something like this, yes. But if it's numerical, it can't be. So you have the ability to deposit data as long as you are comfortable with the fact that you're going to let this be publicly accessible, that your use of that data has expired, or you don't need to use that data anymore, but you want to share it, make it open. The reason why we want to create the correct metadata for it is so that if you created that data set, you will always get recognition and credit for creating that data set. But you don't have intellectual ownership of it. You don't have an IP stake in the data itself. Now, some countries in the world are different. UK and countries that were part of are a part of the Commonwealth have a different attitude, that data is actually copyrightable. So there's some issues within the world or within the global community about who does own and who doesn't own data.